So it's a very great pleasure and honor for us at Civic to have once again with us Dr. Manuel Pastor, whom I'd first like to mention that the basic document that Civic was created under is our strategic plan that was developed in 2013, 2014. Manuel Pastor and his team developed that strategic plan for us. It's still the document that we use to guide the work that we carry out. So we owe a great debt to Manuel Pastor and his team. He's also been with us in other events, including our 2018 annual conference. And that I need to point out that his presentation has been the most popular of the ones we've had in all our regional annual conferences. So that's why it's such a pleasure to have him with us once again. The title of the presentation for this specific day is Immigrant Integration in the Central Valley, New Data, New Challenges, a really great title for the information that I know he's going to be sharing with us today. And just a little bit of information about his background, because it would take us a long time to go through all his amazing work. But Dr. Manuel Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Southern California, where he currently directs the Equity Research Institute at USC, a research center whose slogan is data and analysis to power social change. Great slogan too. Pastor's research has generally focused on issues of the economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities and the social movements seeking to change those realities. His latest book, State of Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future, came out in 2018 and was lauded in a New York Times review as concise, clear, and convincing. 2021 will see the publication of two new books that he just finished, South Central Dreams, Finding Home and Building Community in South LA, co-author with Pierrette Hangdenu Sotelo, a former colleague of mine from UC Berkeley, and Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter, co-author with Chris Benner. So just a little tiny bit of all the amazing work that Manuel Pastor has carried out over the years. And Manuel, welcome once again to an event with us here in the Central Valley. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Great, I'm so happy to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person. I think all of us wish we could be with someone in person. This Zoom life is getting a little irritating. And I want to thank you for mentioning those two new books. I know it sounds like I'm really productive, but that's actually just bad planning. You really should not have two books finishing at the same time. It's way too much work. So I'm going to make a presentation, and what I'm going to do is do it the following way. If you've seen this before, I'm going to present while I'm down in the corner, because who doesn't want to be looking at my face and my emotions the entire time that we're together? So great to be with you. And I will talk on this topic, immigrants in the Central Valley and the state of immigrant integration. I will try to get through this data fairly quickly so that we can have a Q&A. And in particular at the end, I'm going to try to draw some implications for what it means to look forward in the Central Valley and really in California in the current political and social and health climate. I always like to let people know that when I'm speaking, my voice might tire or break a little bit. You might think it's because it's such an emotional experience being with you again via Zoom in the Central Valley. Partly that's true, but also I have a voice condition called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. It gets treated once a month with Botox, which is why I look so remarkably preserved for someone who's about to cross the threshold into 65. But it also means that my voice can be a bit harsh or a bit breathy. So if you hear that, that's the reason why. So when we think about immigrants in the Central Valley, and let me just kind of scoot out of the way of this presentation, see which way gets me out of the way of the presentation. You could see the share of immigrants has been on the rise from 1970 going forward. The Central Valley, and now in this case, it's only Fresno, Kern, and San Joaquin counties. In the rest of the presentation, we'll sort of zoom out to the Central Valley, but these are the counties for which data is reliable going back to 1970. You can see that the share of the population that's foreign born actually was pretty low in 1970, has gone up, but actually relative to, say, Los Angeles or even Santa Clara County, you actually have a share of foreign born that is lower than those other areas of the state. Part of that is that you've got a much younger population, and that young population is almost entirely US born. But we can also see how this has changed over time in terms of maps. This is a map of the Central Valley with the Bay Area showing, and you could see that in 1980, really, there were very few concentrations of immigrants. But as you move forward to 1990, 2000, and then the current period, you could see that that population has gotten much larger. So just like the share of immigrants has gone up, the sort of areas in which immigrants live has concluded all sorts of places, big concentrations in the San Joaquin, Stanislaus, Fresno, and Kern County areas. Fresno, particularly around the city of Fresno. So who are the region's immigrants? Well, you can see here, when you look at the entire population, 78% of your population is US born, but another 8% of your population is naturalized citizens, another 7% folks who have legal permission to be in the country, lawful permanent residents for the most part, but 7% of the overall population of the San Joaquin, of the Central Valley is undocumented. And you can see how that breaks down by ethnicity as well. Very small number of white folks who are immigrants. When you get to the Latino population, you could see that the overwhelming share of Latinos in the Central Valley are actually US born. 15% of the overall county is Latino immigrant, 36% of the overall, not county, but Central Valley region, US born Latinos. By the way, this is a very important fact because there's a lot of latent voting power in that 36% of the county population that's US born. Some can't vote because they're too young, but there's a lot of folks who are US born, could vote, but don't register and don't vote. And since their lives are so intertwined with the lives of immigrants, documented and otherwise, when they don't vote, that affects the warmth of welcome and local policy. But one of the things for you to notice here, which I think is really important, if you look at the sort of Latino, the blue population, overwhelming share of that, pretty much more than 2 to 1 US born. But when you move to the Asian population is more immigrant than it is US born, often more recently arrived, but generally more immigrant. That, by the way, is typical of the Latino and Asian population that comes up all over the state, that the Latino population is more US born than the Asian population. We'll look at the Middle East immigrants in a second in these demographic categories. Unfortunately, the census counts folks from the Middle East as white. So they're part of that 32%, but we'll break that out in a minute. And by the way, there's a really interesting story about that for all you census lovers. In the census, the last census, the census for years was trying out a new question in which they both created categories for people from the Middle East and North Africa to pull themselves off as a separate category. And they also created an opportunity for Latinos to not be forced by this two-question setup: are you Latino or Hispanic or not? And then what race are you? But to simply mark Latino and then mark any other race that they wanted. And what they found out when they ran this test was that you got a lot more satisfaction on the part of Middle Eastern and North African folks because they were able to mark their ethnicity, and also that more Latinos who were less sort of shocked by this two-step question marked themselves off. So they tested it. They found out that it worked really well. And therefore, the Trump administration decided to not use it because it was tested and would have resulted in more Latinos identifying themselves as Latinos and more Middle Eastern people being able to identify themselves as an ethnicity. Instead, as you know, they took a question that they did not test, the question about being documented or not, and they tried to force that into the census. It was not forced in, but very typical of that administration to take a tested question that would have provided us better data and thrown it out in favor of an untested question that would have provided us really bad data in terms of an undercount. You can tell I'm a census lover and that I have feelings about this. So what else about our region's immigrants? You can see that the undocumented are overwhelmingly Latino. Lawful permanent residents, very strong share are Latino. And for the naturalized citizens, as you can see here, less of a share are Latino, more of a share are Asian. Why is that? As we'll see a little bit later in the presentation, Asians who are eligible to naturalize have a much higher rate of naturalization than Latinos. And this is an issue that should be addressed. I know that it is one of the priorities for Civic. It's really key for immigrant integration. Now, it's always important to disaggregate these groups because Asian American Pacific Islander means many different things, as in fact does Latino, although not in the Central Valley. And certainly there's a way to think about our Middle Eastern, Armenian, and other immigrants who get classified as white by the census. But when you look at the AAPI immigrant population, these are ordered by their immigrant population, you can see that the Filipino community is the most populous immigrant population. It also has a very high share of people who are immigrants. Indian is next, Chinese follows, then the Hmong, and Cambodians, Laotians, Vietnamese, etc. after that. But your biggest groups, Filipino, Indian, Chinese, and Hmong. For the Latino immigrant population, the fascinating thing here is that you're overwhelmingly Mexican. So of the 630,000 immigrants who also identify as Latino, 500,000 of them are Mexican. There are Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and then that all other Latino are people from other parts of South and Central America, but not populous enough to be identified as a single country. But you can see that this is a highly Mexican population. And for the Middle Eastern, North African, and here we're calling Armenians Middle Eastern, some think of them as European, you can see that you have a big Iranian or Persian population, a sizable Arab population, and a sizable Armenian population, which you're very familiar with. So there's diversity within the diversity. It's important to be able to pay attention to those differences. What's the age distribution like? One of the things to notice about this chart is that when you look at the US born, 35% of the US born population is below the age of 18. Of the US born population, you have a lot of kids in this region compared to the rest of California. For the rest of California, the kids as a share of the US born is generally closer to 25%. the fact that it's at 35% is partly that you've got a lot of US born kids who have immigrant parents, but it's also the fact that you in the Central Valley are the place where the child population is actually growing, even as it's declining in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles. Why is that? Housing prices. You have a very high housing burden relative to your income levels, but you have cheap housing prices, and it attracts families who are trying to figure out where they can have a starter home or where they can be able to afford an apartment. But you've got a more youthful population than the rest of the state. Now, but another thing to take a look at is when you look at the undocumented population, 50% are between the ages of 30 and 45, kind of prime working age. Now, of course, since I'm 64, I think that next group is really prime, or at least to be celebrated in some kind of a way. But you can see that you've got, for the undocumented, basically a working age population. The group between, for example, 18 and 64 is basically almost the entire group, minus the small share of undocumented children. Now, one of the things that when people hear the word undocumented, think, not this group because you're sophisticated, you know the data and you know the folks that you work with, is they tend to think of undocumented folks as people who have arrived, are likely, got there just a few years ago, lightly settled, not deeply entwined into the social fabric, economic fabric, community fabric of the places where they live. But as you can see, that's not the case, in particular in the Central Valley. 72% of undocumented immigrants in the Central Valley have been in the United States for more than a decade. So they're deeply settled. They are exactly the kind of group, when people talk about immigration reform, that immigration reform is intended for. People who have deep roots, but don't necessarily have the status to fully realize the benefits of those deep roots, as we'll see when we look at some of the economic data below. And you could see what the deeply rooted, Nate, by the way, this is a higher share of undocumented folks who've been in the United States for more than a decade than in the US. So you've got more settled undocumented immigrants, than in California, which is about 2/3 of undocumented immigrants in California overall have been in the country for more than a decade. It's about 70% in LA, 72% in the Central Valley. So very settled undocumented population, not going anywhere. It needs services, it needs attention. And partly because of the settled nature of the undocumented immigrant population, it means that they've had a chance to form families. And what's fascinating about this, there's about 284,000 undocumented immigrants in the Central Valley, but there are 321,000 US born, US citizen family members who are living with them. A lot of them kids, but a lot of them aunts, uncles, spouses. I guess the plural of spouses is spice, but I'm not sure that people actually use that much. And then there's another 85,000 lawful permanent residents who live with undocumented family members. One of the reasons why this is important, look at that, that's 400,000 folks. And this is living in the same house who are either US born or lawful permanent residents living with those 300,000 undocumented family members. Why is this important? For example, you'll remember that in the relief program last year under the Trump administration, if you lived in a mixed status family where two people filed taxes, one with a Social Security number, another one with an I-10 individual taxpayer identification number, that you were not permitted to collect on those taxes, but you're not committed to collect the relief because one of them family members had filed with an I-10 and your kids were not eligible either. So this mixed status family issue had deep impacts on California in general, certainly in the Central Valley. Now, what does it look like economically? for immigrants in the Central Valley. I'm going to move to these a little more rapidly because to some extent they're a bit repetitive. But what this looks at is the population that makes at least $15 an hour or more relative to the population that makes less than $15 an hour. You'll see that 3/4 of the population making at least $15 an hour or more is US born. Smaller shares of that population are immigrant. But when you look at the folks who are making less than $15 an hour, you'll see that's a large share there of undocumented folks, of lawful permanent residents, and even of naturalized citizens, but in particular of undocumented folks and LPRs. And this is also reflected in the median hourly wage by nativity. If you look in particular at the chart on the right, you'll see that the median hourly wage, this is for full-time year-round workers, for even naturalized citizens is lower than it is for the US born. But that median wage, and median means half higher, half lower, that median wage is actually lower for lawful permanent residents, LPRs. And if you look, it's less than the minimum, it's what will be the statewide minimum wage for undocumented folks. So lots of folks who may be making less than the minimum wage because of the nature of employment that they've got. And what this means is that when you look at the percent of people who are living below 200% of the poverty level, which is what most people tend to think of now as, economic insecurity. When you are making less than 200% of the poverty level, that economic insecurity factor is super high for the undocumented and pretty high for LPR. And what this shows you is something that I think is kind of important. It's looking at the median household income by race and nativity, should have said that, in the Central Valley. And here, the story that I want to lift up, because it'll become a little bit important as I close, is the following. You can see here that the poorest groups are Black people in the Central Valley, Latino immigrants, and Latino US born. That the AAPI household income is actually somewhat high. For the US born, it actually exceeds the level of the white US born. It's also fairly high for the immigrant AAPI community. Now it's quite high for Black immigrants. I'll touch on why that is in just a minute. But let me just stress again the things I want you to pull from this chart. That Black folks and Latino folks in the Central Valley share a common level of economic distress and therefore should share more about what is the correct economic agenda to address some of these issues. That you see this high level of income for Black immigrants. By the way, that's a relatively small sample size, but it's also the case that people don't realize that Black immigrants are amongst the most highly educated immigrants in the United States. It's something people don't realize, but in fact, the continent that sends us the most educated immigrants is not Asia as a share of immigrants in terms of their education, but actually because lots of working class folks come from Asia too, but rather Africa. And it makes sense when you think about it. It's so hard to get here from Africa. You have to be someone who's probably pretty educated and knows how to work the system, including the diversity lottery, but also systems within your own country, and have the assets to be able to make the move. What about the AAPI community and those high incomes? Well, one of the things to realize is that this is quite different depending on the immigrant group. So Indians and Filipinos, relatively high wages. But when you get down to the Cambodians, Hmong, and Laotians, you're looking at very low household incomes. So there's diversity within the diversity, and in particular, tremendous diverse immigrant experiences for the Asian immigrant population. So that's a population that's always so useful to disaggregate data. In terms of the educational attainment by nativity in the Central Valley, you can see here that 70% of the undocumented population has less than a high school degree, that the naturalized citizen population is a kind of interesting sandwiched, or kind of has a little bit of both sides. 29% have less than a high school degree, but 20% have a bachelor's degree or higher, actually topping the bachelor's degree or higher outcome for the US born. What is that about? Again, it speaks to the bifurcation or separate experiences of some immigrants who are relatively highly educated and more likely to naturalize, some Asian immigrant groups, and then also a lot of other immigrant groups who are occupying the bottom rungs of labor markets, regardless of their status. By gender, this is looking at part-time work versus full-time work. What actually is kind of interesting here, there's a significant gender difference with women being far more likely to have part-time work than men, but those differences are very similar, whether you're talking about immigrant women or US-born women. In terms of the working poor in the Central Valley, what you can tell by looking at this chart is that working poor is defined as having a full-time, year-round job, but still falling below 200% of the poverty level. And you can see by that standard, 33% of the undocumented population is working poor, much higher rates than any other population, including the US born, which has a working poor rate of 10%. I'm going to do one other set of charts, then jump over a bunch to get to some of the lessons and make sure we open up for questions. One of the challenges with Zoom is that when you give a talk in person, you can make a lot more jokes and hear and feel the reaction. You can read the room instead of trying to read the Zoom, and you can tell whether or not you can keep going with charts. But also it turns out, of course, that people get more tired with Zoom than they do in a room. And so getting to Q&A, getting to some of the big lessons is really crucial. Now, this is a chart that's interesting. And what it tries to do is to look at essential work, which is work that needs to go on, and then non-essential work, with essential and non-essential having been defined by the federal government. And here risk means COVID risk. And so for the essential higher risk, it's jobs like meatpacking, grocery store clerks, stuff like that, the truck driver. For non-essential higher risk, it's things like retail, restaurants, and hospitality. For essential lower risk, what's interesting is that that is how the federal government classified farm work, as essential but low risk. Why? Because risk here is defined as the risk at work. And so when they were defining agriculture as low risk, they were thinking about the fact that people could be 6 foot apart picking crops and be outdoors. But they weren't thinking about the conditions of having to ride a bus with others to go to the field. They weren't thinking about the conditions in which people are living, overcrowded either farm worker housing or overcrowded housing if people live in their own private housing. So kind of a misnomer, particularly for the Central Valley. And you could see here that in terms of essential work, including the so-called lower risk work, that Latino immigrants super indexed in that essential work, much of it high risk, but also the case that Black folks were highly indexed or concentrated in the essential higher risk work. Another quirk to pay attention to here is the non-essential higher risk work. As I mentioned, things like retail and restaurants, things that got shut down and lost a lot of employment. Rent burden, not so much news here. Everybody's rent burden in the Central Valley, regardless of the nativity or almost of race. It's partly because while housing is relatively inexpensive, the incomes are low as well. The group, however, that has the highest rent burden are Black households, and they have both the highest overall rent burden and severe rent burden. Overall rent burden is defined as paying more than 30% of your income on rent. Severe rent burden is paying 50% of rent, of income on your rent. So I'm just gonna jump over these to get to this. Just in terms of thinking about the work ahead, linguistic isolation, which means that nobody above the age of 15 in a household speaks English well or very well, extraordinarily high for the undocumented population. That's 36% for the LPRs, 22% for a household headed by a naturalized citizen. You may ask how it's possible that 2% of US-born households are headed by someone who speaks English very well. But of course, if that person grew up in a community where English was very much a second language, that's possible. Or looking at some of my students' papers occasionally, I might think that there's a lot of US-born people who seem linguistically isolated. So let's move to this slide and then draw a few lessons for the current moment. This is the share of residents on the wrong side of the digital divide. How do people define the digital divide? People who research this define the digital divide as whether or not your household has both high-speed internet and a computer or laptop. High-speed internet, so you can actually access things at a reasonable volume, and a computer or laptop because hopefully this will show, yes, this is my cell phone, cute iPhone, but you don't really want to do your homework on it. And that's been a problem, even as school districts have responded by sending kids home with hotspots and Chromebooks. Those are just not ideal for the kind of work that needs to be done, but that's not available in a lot of immigrant households and a lot of Latino households generally. So here you can see the percent of residents on the wrong side of digital divide by race and nativity. One thing about the Central Valley, you have a much higher share overall of residents who are on the wrong side of digital divide, who don't have broadband coming to their homes or don't have the assets to buy a computer or to be able to pay for the service. But you can see that this is particularly high for US-born Blacks, Black people, African Americans, and very high for Latinos, but particularly for immigrant Latinos, meaning that lots of kids who were sent home to do remote learning as schools shut down found themselves not being able to learn a lot, and we're going to be dealing with a year of lost learning. This is the percent of people without health insurance, despite best efforts, super high for undocumented folks. That remains something that we need to be able to work on at a state level, and Civic in the Central Valley can be an important part of that. This is just naturalization rates. And let me just say a word about that. This is for immigrants who are eligible to naturalize meaning that they've been in the country for 5 years, or they've been in the country for 3 years and they're married to a US citizen. And you can see here that the naturalization rates for Latinos, and this is of eligible to naturalize, so it's not undocumented, it's not recently arrived LPRs. The naturalization rates for Latinos are dismal. They're about 60% of what they are for Asian immigrants or white for the immigrants. For the most part, that's European and, again, the classification of Middle East, North African, that falls in that white category according to the census. This is a very important issue, the lack of Latino naturalization. It's something I'll come to. So you've seen a lot of data. What does that mean for our work? So I'm going to say a couple of things here. The first is that the view from Washington is muddled. The Biden administration came in and said that they would pursue immigration reform. They haven't worked very hard at it. They haven't done any of the politicking for it. Their attention has been captured by dealing with the COVID crisis, then trying to push forward their infrastructure bill. There has been some shift in enforcement, but deportations remain a problem and enforcement at the border remains an issue. There is a big risk of seeing what happened with the Obama administration happen again. That is, that there'll be so much on the Biden plate that immigrants will get the short end of the policy stick. It's going to require that the national advocacy groups continue to apply pressure and actually make the Biden administration aware of the voting power of immigrants and of their immigrant-sensitive allies who are US-born residents and voters. But frankly, the view from Washington is muddled. It's going to be very hard to get immigration reform through the Senate, particularly given the recalcitrance of the GOP on so many issues and the wish to deny Biden victories. So we may be able to move something on Dreamers. There may be able to move something on farm workers or essential workers, but I think that there are some real challenges. The view from Sacramento is more favorable. A couple of different reasons. One is thanks to the hard work of all of you. With so many of you, I was advocating for the governor to try to provide relief to undocumented Californians when the federal government was not, to try to provide access to health insurance when the federal government was not, understanding that these are long settled, undocumented Californians, and as a result, we had a responsibility to pay attention. The good news is that the governor, with pressure from all of you and from state senators and state assembly people, has begun to move in this direction and realize that it's a political gainer, not politically costly. So I think there's more opportunities, but the big task is going to be to examine every system, for example, workforce development, and ask the question, is it open to undocumented Californians, and how can we make it possible for people to tap into the assistance that they need? Again, they're listening a little bit more. For example, in the new budget is $25 million to put ESL in the community colleges so that immigrants can take ESL classes and acquire community college credit. So there's real possibilities, particularly if things are stymied in DC. But none of the change that is happening locally or happening in California is happening by accident. It's the result of organizing, it's the result of advocacy, it's the result of civic engagement. And that's exactly what Civic has been all about since its founding. So moving forward is also going to require a clear and focused agenda. I don't know what you've been thinking up, but here are 7 things I would urge you to consider. First, continue to advocate for access to COVID vaccines and COVID assistance. We know that the system that was set up at the beginning was inequitable by design. When you set up a system where your best shot of getting a shot is to have a computer, high-speed internet, the technological sophistication to put an automatic refresher on your browser, the kind of job where you can take time off in the middle of the day and afford to lose half a day's pay or have a salary and it really doesn't make a difference, in a private vehicle to get to a vaccination site, you know you've set up a system that's going to reproduce inequality, and that's what it did. We need mobile clinics. We need vaccinations at work. We need vaccinations at school sites. We need to go after the people who need to be vaccinated and want to be vaccinated, but aren't seeing the opportunity, can't afford to lose a half day's work, etc. We need to ensure access to COVID vaccines. Second, we need to look forward. I just used the example of designing a vaccine system that was destined to produce inequality. If somebody had thought about that and listened, because I had thought about it and I was saying it was going to be unfair, you would not have seen those results. So we need to look forward. What do I mean by that? As we start to crawl our way back into public life and into the economy functioning more fully, it's going to be a little bit like those scenes in a horror movie after an apocalypse when people come crawling out. There's going to be so much economic damage that's been done in the last year to immigrants and others. There's going to be so much mental health trauma that needs to be dealt with. So much pent up health issues. So much lost learning that needs to be addressed by more schooling, more after school opportunities, etc. So we need to look forward at the damage that will be revealed as we all start to fully go back and get ahead of it in terms of people's mental and physical health and in terms of their access to financial resources. Third thing, we need to stress racial as well as immigrant justice. This is not a new thing for me. It's not something that I just came up with in the wake of the George Floyd uprisings. I think that the dehumanization of immigrants in our society is fundamentally linked to the anti-Black racism that others Black people, that conveniently forgets the indigenous population and genocide, that deep-rooted racism is what has othered Latino and Asian immigrants in a way that they get unseen and unserviced. And that if we're about immigrant integration, we also need to be about racial justice, because we need to form alliances with others, because immigrant integration looked at that income data you saw before for Black households. Immigrant integration should not be hopscotching over the fate of Black Fresnans, for example, to be able to get into the middle class. But it's about lifting up the bottom floor for everyone. That's what immigrant integration really means. It's deeply intertwined with racial justice. Fourth, we need to broaden the political base for immigration reform. That means seeking out business allies, which do exist on this issue, particularly in agriculture. It means figuring out how to move some Republicans and pressure them this is very important work for those of you in the Central Valley. Fifth, double down on naturalization efforts. There is a sizable population that's eligible to naturalize that has not naturalized. And if they did, then broadening the base for immigration reform would immediately follow, because it would be a political winner, because there'd be a penalty at the ballot box. Even as I'm stressing immigration reform and naturalization, we cannot forget the need to provide and expand protection for undocumented Californians. And as I've mentioned before, I think there's numerous opportunities to go up and down the system and ask questions, what can be opened up. Lastly, we need to invest in extensive and diverse data collection so we can more accurately understand the situation of immigrants. And one thing we're proud to make you aware of is the California Immigrant Data Portal. There's the URL right there at which you can download lots of the data that was available in this presentation. Make this presentation, you can actually download it and it will automatically load up into a PowerPoint. That's pretty cool. But when you do that, you don't get me as a talker. So, I mean, it comes up a little short, but still, it's a way of really spreading the knowledge around. So I hope this was informative in terms of the diverse immigrant population, that it's inspiring in terms of the work that lies ahead, and challenging by understanding that the terrain in DC isn't as favorable as we might like, that California opens up lots of opportunities, but that none of it is going to change unless we actually actively work on making sure that we are organizing, advocating, naturalizing, and engaging civically in full measure. Thank you.
Manuel, thank you very much for your insightful analysis. And if we can open it up now for partners who are on the call, if they have questions, if you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. So I know there are also a number of questions in the chat box, but I think right now, if you can raise your hand and want to ask a question, make a comment, please do so. Just be brief so we can allow more people to participate. So Mimo had raised hand. If you can speak, you're unmuted.
You may need to unmute yourself.
But let me, while that happens, let me call your attention, Manuel, to one comment that John Werner also included in the chat box, indicating that in the current budget, in the May revise, he indicates the May budget revise did not include priority funding for California adult education program. And John Werner is one of the leaders of the adult education consortia here in the Central Valley. So ESL is a major priority for them. I don't know if you'd like to comment anything about that.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think this is one thing that we need to get to the governor and point out as being a mistake. And I think one way to do that is to advocate both through the adult education channels and then also try to directly reach, and I will say that I will try to reach Julie Sue, because it's actually also incredibly important, as John would, I hope if he comes off mute, testify and tell us a little bit. It's an incredibly important thing for economic advancement. When you learn English, you can move from the back of the room, back of the hotel cleaning to the front and be able to service clients. You can move from washing dishes to being a server. You can move to being able to be a foreman. That's something a little bit dear to me because my dad, actually, I thought he spoke pretty pretty good English, but he would get nervous in those settings that were a little bit more formal. And every time he had to take an English test to become a foreman, he wasn't able to pass that and wound up not being able to move up in the work that he was doing as the repair of industrial air conditioners. So English in our research is also really associated with about a 15% increase in pay, holding everything else constant in terms of people's education, gender, spot in the labor market, et cetera. So it's an incredibly important thing. And it also makes naturalization a little bit easier. So I do think that we should lift this up a bit more and advocate for it. John, do you want to add something to that? And then it looks like Mimo is unmuted.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I didn't know if my mic was working. So yeah, the May revise for the folks in adult ed was just really a blow to us. Adult ed did get a 1.7% COLA, while our, we're largely operated by K-12 school districts, received a 5.07% equalization. What that does is that actually hurts the adult ed programs because the K-12 districts will go negotiate salaries and pay increases with their unions, but the adult ed folks who are subject to those collective bargaining agreements don't have the privilege of the 5%, COLA to help them out. So what happens then is they have to honor those locally negotiated agreements on 1.7% COLA. Net effect is it's a reduction in force, which is then, as we know, a reduction in service provision. The other thing that happened in that May revise is we saw the colleges, and we appreciate the colleges getting all sorts of money. Education is the way out of poverty for me. And so, I want to see that money flow out to education any way possible, but it hurt in that the colleges did receive $50-some million for career technical education with the expectation by the administration that it would be tied to English as a second language instruction, something that California's adult schools have been doing for a long time, particularly under their We Owe It Title II grant status. So, our adult schools they started in ESL in the basement of St. Mary's Church in San Francisco in the mid 1800s. 70-some percent, depending on where you're at in California, of the population we serve are recent immigrants. And it may be an ESL class, it may be an citizenship prep class. It very well may be that integrated career technical education with ESL. We do a lot of those around here in the Valley that are really great for getting people to that $20 to $25 an hour wage. And yet we're not seeing year after year, we just don't see adult ed recognized as a tool to fight poverty and help people by our state. It's just frustrating. So thank you for the time to talk.
Thanks a lot, John. And I would really urge people to advocate for that. Again, I vow that I will try to use my context to lift this up. I think it's good that the community colleges will supplement the adult ed effort, but it should not be a substitute, and ESL is incredibly important. Maybe Mimo, who sounds like he figured out how to unmute.
If not, Marisa, you can also unmute.
Oh, Mimo just unmuted.
Okay.
But we don't hear her voice. Let's go to Marisa.
Hi. So I'm also a very big interest in the census as well. I know that the Hispanic/Latinx, as well as Middle Eastern and North African, is not considered a race. Do you think if it was considered a race, if there would be more attention as well as funding towards efforts to assist those populations more strongly? Do you think that would be a bigger benefit if they were recognized as races in the census?
Well, the way that the census tried to do it was a little bit different the last time. Again, it was what got overruled. What the census does now is they ask you first whether you're Latino or non-Latino, Hispanic or non-Hispanic, and then they ask you what race you are. And there's a long story about both why they do that, and then also the fact that they got very frustrated because they kept wanting to put a racial category on Latinos, and Latinos kept marking other instead of, they had white, black, Asian, Native American, and other, and Latinos kept marking other, which frustrated the census because they wanted folks to mark a race other than other. And we actually wrote a really interesting article about that, which was called Where in the World is Juan and What Color Does He Think He Is? Based on how Latinos were answering the racial question on the census. And one of the interesting findings in the paper was most people had predicted that the longer that immigrants stayed in the United States, the more likely they were to mark a race like white versus other. But it turned out that the longer you were in the United States, the less likely you were to mark white, the more likely you were to mark other, because your experience of being othered in the United States affected your conception of your race. What census academics and experts realized in the period between 2010 and 2020 was that we were asking the question, are you Hispanic, non-Hispanic, what race are you? In ways that didn't suit how people felt and didn't allow particular groups like Middle Easterners to be able to, who again, don't feel white in terms of their treatment in this country, to be able to bring themselves out. So rather than asking, what race are you? They just said, how do you identify? And put Latino, and you could mark anything you wanted. So you could mark Latino, you could mark Middle Eastern, you could mark white European, you could mark black, etc. That question worked really well. And it's the question that fits a more modern sense of ethnicity and race, that actually, because it fit better, got more Latinos to mark themselves as Latino than the other binary question, because they could say a couple things at the same time. And that's the question that the Trump administration took off, even though it had been field tested and worked really well. I think because it would have revealed even more Latinos than this current census is going to reveal.
Thank you very much. I absolutely agree. I think it's really important to be as inclusive as possible in those questions. And the white experience, I feel, is very inherently different from somebody who lives in the Middle East, North Africa, as well as people who identify within the Latinx population who can only identify as white within those categories. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. So Mimo, if you can please unmute, you can ask question or comment. Well, let me ask a question to Manuel and also to the colleagues who are still with us for a last comment from you, Manuel. I think one of the important takeaways that I have from your presentation is that it confirms the diversity of the immigrant communities that we have in the Central Valley, the importance of addressing the needs and the characteristics that they might have. And we have in the Central Valley, however, still a very limited capacity to serve them with immigrant legal services.
Yes.
And I wonder if the colleagues that are still with us right now that do provide legal services, how they perceive the challenges at present to address those needs of a very diverse immigrant population in the Central Valley, even pointing out that even though Mexicans make up a very large component of it, but we have a great number of nationalities, of people of different origins, of different languages, and a very limited legal capacity to provide that cultural linguistic competence. And I wonder if anybody has, or the legal service providers has any comment, or if you have any comment about that, Manuel.
Well, a couple comments. It's not just legal services, but all sorts of services that are aimed at the immigrant community. I mean, John was mentioning ESL, that are scarce or shortchanged. And building up that infrastructure in the Central Valley, I think, is going to require a few things. I will send along this presentation. I saw a question about that to Jesus so that you can use it to advocate around, in particular, these issues of how diverse the population is and what needs to be done to kind of include the full panorama of the immigrant experiences in servicing. I think it's also really important to stress the long-rooted nature of the undocumented population, the deeply settled nature of that population, the reliance of the Central Valley on an immigrant workforce, the extent of mixed status families, which is actually more in this, you have more mixed status families, meaning more US citizens and LPR folks living with undocumented folks as a share than in other parts of the state. So that's really important to stress to your local policymakers. And then I think it's important to also stress to the state. You know, the governor has a program he's quite fond of, Regions Rise. And it's about trying to make sure that resources go to regions, Central Valley, Inland California, including the Inland Empire, that have not seen their fair share of investments. But your region will not rise unless immigrants rise as well. And it requires organizing, advocacy, and engagement to push your local policymakers and state policymakers to be aware of the data that I presented today, to take it into account when they are making decisions, and to realize that they will be held accountable at election time.
Thank you, Manuel, for your excellent presentation. And I want to stress one of these last sentences that you made: our region will not rise if immigrants will not rise. I think that makes for another book title. Thank you, everyone who has joined us. I'm very happy that you were able to be with us today. We're recording the video, so we'll make it accessible as well. And if Manuel allows us also to have access to his PowerPoint presentation, we'll share that with you as well. So thank you very much. It has been not only enjoyable, but very informative and additional information to help us do a better job of serving our local communities here in the Central Valley. Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Siempre un placer estar con ustedes. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you all.